When people talk about the Bible as a historical document, the story of the Exodus is usually front and center. A massive migration of Hebrew slaves out of Egypt, led by a prophet, chased by armies, saved by miracles. It's one of the most dramatic narratives in the entire Old Testament. And over the years, countless believers have tried to prove it actually happened. Not metaphorically, literally. The Red Sea parted, the 10 plagues struck. The desert wanderings took 40 years. Manna fell from the sky. It's not just a story, it's a foundation. If the Exodus didn't happen, the whole concept of divine covenant, of being chosen, starts to unravel. So there's been a lot of motivation, both theological and political, to make the story line up with archaeology. And occasionally, a headline pops up that seems to offer a breakthrough. A discovery that, at first glance, might seem to validate some part of the Exodus account. But what happens when we really examine these claims? When we set aside the emotional pull of the story and just follow the evidence? Let's take a closer look at 9 discoveries often cited as proof of the Exodus and see what they actually tell us. First, the city of Pi-Ramesses. Some researchers link this city to the biblical Ramses, which the Hebrews are said to have helped build. It's a real place, a capital in the Nile Delta during the reign of Ramesses II. So, is that confirmation? Not exactly. The problem is dating. Pi-Ramesses wasn't built until the 13th century BCE, which is centuries after the most generous timelines place the patriarchs in Egypt. Worse, the site was abandoned before the supposed Exodus. It's like claiming you helped build a city that didn't exist yet. The Bible may have retrofitted the name Ramses into the story simply because it was familiar to later audiences. It's a bit like setting a Roman Empire story in the Middle Ages and calling the capital Washington. Second, the Ipuwer Papyrus. This ancient Egyptian document lists disasters, rivers turning to blood, chaos in the land, even mentions of servants fleeing. Sounds a lot like the plagues, right? But context matters. Scholars date the Ipuwer text to a much earlier period, long before any plausible timeline for the Exodus. And it's not even a historical record. It's a poem, a piece of literature lamenting chaos, much like we might write dystopian fiction. Trying to match this with the biblical plagues is like quoting Shakespeare's Macbeth as evidence of political instability in Scotland. Then there's the famous Yam Suf, the so-called parting of the Red Sea. In Hebrew, the term actually means Sea of Reeds, which changes things. The original text likely referred to a shallow, marshy area, not a massive sea. Some researchers speculate that a strong wind might have pushed back water in a reed swamp, exposing a path briefly. That's interesting from a meteorological standpoint, but it's a far cry from the image of Moses raising his staff and watching towering walls of water open up. The real phenomenon, if it happened, would have been more like crossing a damp field in a windstorm. One of the more bizarre claims comes from underwater anomalies in the Gulf of Aqaba. Some self-styled explorers have pointed to coral formations vaguely resembling chariot wheels. These photos spread like wildfire online, especially in Christian circles. But the truth is, coral grows in symmetrical shapes all the time. Without actual artifacts, wood, metal, inscriptions, it's just pareidolia. The brain sees what it wants to see. It's the same psychological trick that makes us see faces on toast or animals in clouds. Another oft-cited discovery is the existence of Semitic names in Egyptian records. There's some truth here. We do find evidence of Semitic people living in Egypt, working, even rising in ranks during certain periods. But that's not surprising. Egypt was a major empire. People migrated for work, war, and trade. The presence of Semitic names doesn't equal Hebrew slaves building pyramids or staging a mass escape. It's like finding Spanish surnames in Florida and assuming the Alamo just happened there. Then there's the argument from silence, the idea that the lack of Egyptian records mentioning the Exodus somehow proves it happened. After all, Egypt wouldn't want to record a national embarrassment. It's a convenient claim, but it's also dangerous. Using silence as proof is a dead end. By that logic, anything that isn't written down becomes more likely to be true. But real history doesn't work that way. The absence of evidence isn't automatically evidence of absence. But it's not confirmation either, especially when you're talking about an event that supposedly devastated an entire country. You'd expect something. Ruins, graves, economic collapse, yet we find none of it. The story of Mount Sinai is another frequent talking point. Several mountains have been proposed as the real Mount Sinai, from Jebel Musa in the Sinai Peninsula to others in Saudi Arabia. Expeditions to these sites claim to have found altars, inscriptions, and burned peaks, but again, the dating doesn't match, and none of the findings are uniquely Hebrew. You can find rock art and fire-scorched stones all over the region. It's like stumbling across an old campfire in the Rockies and declaring it the site of the Declaration of Independence. There's also a strange cluster of circular stone formations in the Negev desert. Some suggest they were Hebrew encampments, possibly part of the 40-year wandering, but the evidence is inconclusive. These could be anything: Bedouin camps, shepherd enclosures, even military outposts. Without writing, tools, or distinctive artifacts, they remain ambiguous. At best, they're a maybe. At worst, they're a blank canvas for religious imagination. Finally, let's talk about the Merneptah stele. This is one of the most frequently cited artifacts in biblical archaeology. It's a stone inscription from around 1208 BCE that mentions a people called Israel in Canaan, the earliest known reference to the name. That's significant, but also complicated. It doesn't say they came from Egypt. It doesn't mention an exodus. It just notes that a group called Israel was already living in the land. If anything, it undermines the idea of a recent large-scale migration. It suggests continuity in the region, not conquest, not wandering, and not miracles. So, what are we left with? A handful of misinterpreted artifacts, ambiguous inscriptions, and a lot of motivated reasoning. The desire to find the Exodus in history has driven decades of digging, but confirmation remains elusive. And that matters, because if a story has to be constantly retrofitted to match reality, then maybe it wasn't reality to begin with. The Exodus narrative serves a purpose. It tells a community that they were chosen, that they were delivered, that their suffering had meaning. That's powerful. But power and truth aren't always the same thing. What we see in the archaeological record is not a dramatic escape, not divine intervention, but something much more human. A slow movement of people, intermingling of cultures, and the construction of national identity through storytelling. We all do it. Nations build myths, religions amplify them, and in the absence of hard evidence, those stories fill the gaps. But eventually, we have to ask, are we seeking truth, or are we protecting the stories we've already decided are true? The line between history and myth isn't always clear, but pretending the line doesn't exist doesn't make the myth real. Let the evidence speak, even if it whispers something we didn't expect.